All right. Well, welcome, everyone. It's good to see so many new and familiar faces. Welcome to this Hedgehog Noontime Discussion. I'm Kyle Williams, an editor at the Hedgehog Review. Before we get started, I just want to make a brief announcement. We have a new issue of the Hedgehog, the theme of which is titled Hope Itself, that's out on newsstands and in mailboxes and online. So you can go to hedgehogreview.com to subscribe, and there you'll get full access to the new issue, as well as to the back catalog. In the coming weeks and months, we'll be releasing essays from the latest issue from behind the paywall. So be sure to come back to our website for content from the issue and for our web features. An essay that we've made available to the public so far this week is linked in the Zoom chat. I just posted that on there. It's a piece that we'll be talking about some in the discussion today. So check that out, subscribe, and tell your friends. Our topic today is futurelessness, hope, despair, and the aesthetics of internet culture. This is something that we've been talking about here in the office quite a bit over the last few months as we've been working on the latest issue. To put the topic simply, we live in a moment that I think feels sort of stuck, as if nothing big or new feels all that possible. A lot of people, especially young people, Zoomers and millennials, seem to share a mood of apathy and pessimism, if not despair. We're caught, it seems, between a sense of stagnation in which everything sort of stays the same, but slowly gets worse, or outright catastrophism in which ecological, nuclear, political disaster seems like it's right around the corner. Now, there are different ways of indexing this mood. Economically, growing inequality, an anemic middle class, wage stagnation. These things have left younger people with economic prospects that are more diminished than previous generations. Technologically, there's stagnation there too. Fewer major breakthroughs, more incremental improvements around the margins. Politically, liberal democracy, once secure, if not triumphant, seems imperiled, not just by events in East Asia and Eastern Europe, but also here in the United States. And socially, deaths of despair, defined in terms of suicides and overdoses, have reached a point of crisis in some parts of the country. And in a less acute way, people are having a harder time forming families and households, investing in houses and retirement, and having children, sometimes deliberately choosing childlessness because of the threat of climate change, among other things. So it might be tempting to conclude that this turn of events is a bitter coincidence, or as many people now strongly believe, that some sort of powerful cabal has formed a conspiracy against us. But one of the questions that we're trying to entertain in the new issue is whether such challenges are truly the cause of our growing sense of hopelessness, or if they are in fact, in part, the result of it, that perhaps our overlapping crises stem from an absence or the precarity of ultimate meaning on which true hope depends. And perhaps the place that we all live now, many of us are terminally are on social media and the internet, only helps to obscure those ideals and meanings. So I'm excited that we have two leading intellectuals and scholars joining us to discuss these questions and more. Tara Isabella Burton is a writer and scholar of religion. Her 2018 book, Social Creature, was named Book of the Year by the New York Times. Her second novel, The World Cannot Give, is out this year from Simon & Schuster. She's also the author of Strange Rites, New Religions for a Godless World, a forthcoming book on the history of self-creation called Self-Made, which, as I understand, is almost finished, multiple essays in many prestigious publications, and of course, the author of On Hope and Holy Fools for the latest issue of the Hedgehog Review. Jon Askonas is assistant professor of politics at the Catholic University of America and a fellow at the Center for the Study of Statesmanship. He's a scholar of international relations and has written for a variety of peer-reviewed publications. He's also written recently for The New Atlantis, Foreign Policy, and Unheard. So quickly, a word about the format. I'm going to hand this over to Tara for 15 to 20 minutes to offer a discussion of her essay and the topic, and then to Jon for 10 to 15 minutes of response. And we'll have a brief back and forth followed by a Q&A. When the time comes, you should raise your digital hand on Zoom to get in line to ask a question, and also feel free to comment or ask questions in the chat, and we'll try to get to those. So Tara Isabella Burton, thank you so much for being here to talk with us.
Thank you so much for having me. I'm delighted to be here. So I'd like to sort of start off today's conversation with an encounter that I had last week at the opera, of all places. We were seeing Tosca, and I met an older woman during the various intervals who was trying to decide whether she wanted to have a happy Tosca or a sad Tosca that evening, by which she meant, was she going to leave before the last act and walk away to have seen a happy opera or a relatively happy opera where the heroine is seemingly triumphant over the villain, or she was going to wait for the denouement. And she described that she did this a lot, and she had her happy la boheme, her sad la boheme. It depended on her mood. And she didn't really think of it as cheating. She just said, what do I want, the happy version or the sad version? There is, in addition, a kind of tradition in opera, like in Gluck's Orpheus and Eurydice, for example. There are indeed certain operatic narratives where we are given happy endings somewhat unexpectedly, perhaps even undeservedly. There's a rich tradition of these kind of rewritings. Maria Theresa, the Empress Maria Theresa Habsburg, was famous for having her court rewrite the ending of Romeo and Juliet. But there is a sense, I think, and not just a sense of artistic completionism, but the question of, is it somehow cheating for there to be a happy ending? Is there something unsatisfying more broadly in things not ending tragically or having a certain kind of tragic denouement? And this question is not just a question about whether we should stay for the last act of operas or whether we should see full operas, but I think that there's a bigger question here, which is the sense that I have, and that my essay is about, that there's a certain kind of aesthetic mode, you can call it a posture, you can call it a conviction, or anything in between, that posits that the truth is tragic, and it takes a certain kind of person, a certain kind of strong, clear-eyed person to look upon the abyss and accept reality the way that it is. And this is a posture, a mode of bravery, of intellectual honesty, as opposed to, or in contrast with, the sheep, the silly people, the foolishly hopeful, who console themselves with happier false narratives. And particularly, there's a sort of strong strain in this in 19th century philosophy. I'm thinking of Schopenhauer, of Nietzsche, and more broadly, this kind of pessimism that also aestheticizes the treatment of the world as tragedy, as something that the strong and only the strong can do. So I think about that now, that posture I see evident in basically contemporary internet culture. And I think this is perhaps more true of certain kind of right-wing internet communities, but I think it's more broadly true that there is a kind of obsession with this self-characterization of ourselves as per the Chinese proverbs. We are living in interesting times. We are living at the end of the world. We are in the apocalypse. Nothing new can be born, and we somehow need to come to terms with that. And I think that there's sort of branches of that mentality that go to the sort of nostalgic or traditionalist, that once things were better, but now they are not, things are only getting worse. There's perhaps an even more nihilistic version that says, this is just the way that things are. I'm thinking of for those of you who are familiar, of the sort of internet ideology known as being black-pilled, a sort of sub-variant of being red-pilled, which sort of derived from the imagery of the Matrix originally, but came to mean sort of a certain kind of awakening to perhaps right-wing talking points, particularly about women and gender, and then black-pilled was then the kind of meme of the next generation of this, which is realizing that everything is terrible and nothing really matters. And I think that these kinds of modes are tempting for a variety of reasons, some of which have just come up earlier in this conversation, which is to say, there are reasons for us not to be hopeful as a society. I think that the sense that the act of having, even having children has become such a kind of loaded, do you have sufficient faith in the world and its possibilities, that child rearing seems like something that's even plausible. I think, we are in a cultural place where there are many reasons not to hope. But I do think that this particular aesthetic mode, that despair is interesting, it is sexy, it is a source of certain kinds of, if not exactly existential meaning, then at least an interesting, rich enough narrative to be sustainable in a time of crisis. That this sort of aestheticization of the tragic does prime us to a state of acceptance and resignation that is, in my mind, and as I write in the essay, a bit self-aggrandizing. And I think that the move that is being made here is a move of a highly individualistic kind of aesthetic move, where we are invited by sort of, perhaps these cultural forces is too nebulous a term, but where there is a temptation for many of us, particularly those of us who live a lot online and are subject to wanting clicks and attention and certain kinds of public aesthetic adulation, as well as perhaps our own private internal aesthetic adulation, to want to see ourselves as separate from, there's so many terms for this, the normies, the sheeple, the NPCs on Twitter, what have you, that don't get the truth. This sort of Nietzschean posture that some of us alone can bravely and with intellectual honesty see the meaninglessness of the world and our own, and see that the only power to shape it lies in our own selves. That is, in fact, kind of alluring. I think that it is, as I put in the essay, kind of sexy. It is a sexy posture about a fantasy of specialness, a fantasy of, if not the kind of straightforward linear heroism, at least whatever the modern equivalent of that might be. But I do want to contrast that mode of living, that mode that I think Twitter inspires in us, primes us, the way that Twitter primes us to kind of see the world, with another mode, a mode that I talk about as the comic, which is the mode in which perhaps, and I'm sort of leaning my Christian cards on the table here, perhaps in the light of some sense of ultimate reality of what is true, perhaps simply in our love of and relations to one another, we are able to experience not just hope for some change in the future or some kind of society that is itself better, but hope that life is in fact worth living as it is, that there is enough to sustain us in our relationships with one another, in the people that we love, in our friendships, that kind of make it all worth it. And this is not a kind of, this is a sort of narrative about certain kinds of, as all comedies are, good comedies are, this is a story of reconciliation. It is a story also learning to laugh at ourselves and to take ourselves less seriously. That we are not, this idea that we are not the kind of sole romantic characters in our own personal dramas, but rather kind of members of a polity who are, where even our kind of most deeply held self-serious images of ourselves are actually kind of flawed. We are the romantic hero, but we're also somebody's weird neighbor or somebody's quirky friend, or and the ways that we live our lives are mundane, and that is a good thing. That the kind of ordinary life that we live offline as well as on is worthy of being seen with sort of both compassion and a little bit of levity. And so in this piece, I talk about the figure of the holy fool, which we find particularly in 19th century Russian literature. One of my favorite novels, The Brothers Karamazov, has sort of several figures that could be coded like this. But the idea that it is foolish and silly and kind of aesthetically uncool not just to hope for the future, but to sort of experience a certain kind of love for humanity that is not predicated on superiority to the common herd, but in fact valorizes the experience of normal people being normal as what it is to be human. And I don't know, and I'm very excited in case Jon has an answer for me, how on earth one moves the culture towards, let's say, a comic mode from a tragic one. How we, I don't know, make comedy cool again. Just, clearly all TV screens in my perfect society just play Frasier all of the time, and inspire us to a love of the good through the sitcom. But perhaps there's slightly less bizarre answers to that one. But I'm curious how a kind of how we divest ourselves from the desire to be interesting, and how we also divest ourselves from the desire to live in quote unquote interesting times. I mean, what would it mean to rather than think of ourselves as this sort of sexy last standers at the end of the apocalypse, to think of ourselves as people in one era of history that, like pretty much every era in history, is just people getting along. There are things about it that are going well and things that are not going well, and that is moderate. And because it is a moderate position, it is not so exciting to argue online or to argue to ourselves. But I think that move of humility to think of ourselves not as the last stand of civilization, whatever that means, whether we're coding ourselves as the heroes defending a certain kind of liberal democracy against the onslaught of fascism, or the kind of particular right-wing narrative that there's a certain kind of civilizational decline and we are going to be the final warriors here. All of these narratives are predicated on an image of separation, that we are somehow different from, more important than, our struggles more significant than anyone in any other era. And I'm curious whether our times can be of interest to us, not because of certain kinds of existential narratives of finality, but simply because we are able to be interested in one another, find one another interesting, separately from these narratives. So I think I'm gonna leave that there and turn it over to Jon. Yes, help. How do we make comedy great again?
We've been making comedy great again. Tara, as always, it's lovely to see you, to hear your voice, to hear your thinking. I think you are and remain the most prominent, in my mind, sort of theorist of the self in our time. And I hope that your new book, does immensely well, and I hope other people are sort of thinking about these problems. Kyle asked me to talk about, quote, the political valences to the specter of futurelessness, which I will try to do. But I think in doing so, I'll also try to engage or to try to push you on whether comedy and tragedy are quite so far apart as they first seem, and whether our problem is that we're too stuck in one mode or the other. And I'll hopefully be able to give a good account of that. So it's funny, you said at the beginning that we have the sense that we are in the apocalypse. And I think, speaking at least from a Christian, I think it is undoubtedly the case that we are in the apocalypse, we are in the end times. The question is, what do you do about it? And in fact, if there's one point of agreement across the political spectrum, at least across these four quadrants that I'm going to discuss, it is in fact that we are at the end times. But we have different sense of why that is and where to go from there. I think we can map this to a spectrum of hopeless to hopeful. When we get to I'm a political scientist, I have to have a 2x2 box. So we have hopeless and hopeful, although I'm not sure hope is actually the right word, which we'll discuss. And then left or right coded. So you mentioned, of course, the kind of black pill doomer, and this is obviously the sort of right wing hopeless mode, this sort of futile struggle against modernity. against the cathedral, against the globalist American empire, whatever you want to call it. This, you know, the bug men are coming. They want to make you sit in the pods and eat the bugs, and they're probably going to win. But we will, you know, we'll valiantly slunk the eggs and lift weights and post about it online until they finally get us, right? And if you didn't understand any of that, good for you. You have a much healthier mental state than Tara or I do. And they're hopeless. They are hopeless in a sense that there isn't really a positive program there, except the kind of Nietzschean vitalist one. I mean, the hardcore adherents of this program will say that that is their program. The program is be better than the mediocrities, the midwits, the people who are running the show, you know, and that will both attract people to your cause and then in some kind of indeterminate way will lead to winning, or at the very least when this whole my more optimistic black pill doomer friends think the whole thing is just going to collapse and they'll be left standing, as it were, or as close to standing as anyone can be. You know, in the last thing, you don't really mention the left-coded version of this, but I think it's actually more culturally dominant, which is, I don't have a good epithet or slogan to describe them, but the kind of progressive movement today is quite hopeless. Actually, I mean that in a literal sense, that they don't have a positive program. There's a very clear sense of what the issues in society are, and especially when it comes to climate change, there is a sense that the only way forward is stopping, right? And I think the best example, you rightly point to this highly aesthetic sense on the kind of right hopeless movement, the black pill doomers. But I find this progressive movement is also incredibly aesthetic. I mean, much of the great progressive art being produced right now is suffused with the kind of negativity, this sort of hopelessness. I mean, I think the kind of Just Stop Oil people who are gluing themselves to artworks and pouring tomato can. I mean, this is unbelievable top tier performance art, quite apart from its moral consideration. So I think that's the hopeless side. But there are actually two kinds of hopeful movements. If those not super involved in online left-wing politics, you might not know that there's a kind of rift, a battle ongoing between these sort of progressives and the burgeoning movement of effective altruism, which is basically utilitarianism updated for the internet age. Interestingly enough, they also agree that this is the hinge of history, right? They just think that we're at an inflection point, and if we make the right decisions, then 10 to the 38th generations of utility maximizing individual beings of indeterminate biological substrate will benefit from our actions today. So they're hopeful in the sense that they have a very long-term view of the future. But there's some kind of a missing quadrant here, which is the you could call it right wing. I probably would just want to say Christian hopeful movement, or a right wing hopeful movement. And this is what I wrote an essay for Compact magazine recently on why conservatism failed. And this is sort of what I'm trying to get a conversation going around. Is I think we actually have a vision for the future, and a future that of our own making within the wheel of sort of human action, but it isn't really being articulated. And I think you're right to point that out. But I'm not sure the hinge here is. I think the question of tragedy and comedy is absolutely brought up in this, but I think it's not one or the other. And I'll say what I mean by that. I was doing a lot of reading and thinking about Girard this summer, and Girard has this model of the resurrection for Girard, the crucifixion resurrection is this kind of turning inside out of this scapegoating process that then Girard says basically makes it so that it doesn't work throughout the rest of history, right? And thinking about that through the lens of Christian theology, there is a kind of, I wouldn't say tragic, but heroic understanding of the action of Christ at the crucifixion under the kind of aegis of the Christus Victor theology one associates with like St. Anselm, right? Of death and the devil and a kind of Christ conquering over death, right? But the Orthodox have a slightly different understanding, which is a kind of stumbling block, right? Where it's almost like Christ, the devil is on his triumphant march, and Christ just sort of puts out a leg, and there's this satanic pratfall, right? And I'm struck by the fact that there's this ambivalent. Both of these are, in some sense, obviously true. So there's something about the way in which, oftentimes these tragic figures are in fact highly ridiculous, and they're only heroic. They're only these kind of tragic heroes from their perspective, right? And similarly, I think a lot of times what we might take for comedy could reveal a sense of the heroic if we just looked at it a little bit differently. My favorite example of this is the greatest comedy of the last 20 years, I think, the movie Midsummer, which is usually characterized as a tragedy. If it's only a horror, it's only a horror from the standpoint of the boyfriend who has this like treats this girl awfully and then meets his terrifying end. But from the standpoint of the woman involved in the story, I won't spoil it. She goes from this unbelievably atomizing, alienating existence to one in which all is well that ends well. She has a community of people that love and care about her. So same thing with Ivan Karamazov, right? I mean, I think from his own standpoint, he's this tragic anti-hero, but he's also a completely ridiculous figure. He's this guy from the sticks who's completely invested in his own sense of contrarian intelligence, that's making himself totally miserable for no reason. And so the question then becomes, if the tragic anti-hero is pregnant with real comedic potential, and if there's a possibility of recovering the heroic within the sort of the comedic of that all's well that ends well, then the question becomes, how do you force that? How do you cast the tragic anti-hero in this ridiculous light, so that they lose their pretense? And I think that's an important question for us. And I think it is also tied up to some extent with the other thing that struck me about your essay, was thinking about hope versus expectation, which is that's a dichotomy that Illich makes, right? The distinction between an expectation where by my own power and increasingly enabled by technology, I can assure a certain kind of future. And much of what we take for the heroic today owes to this kind of, the heroic anti-hero as the sort of overcomer of all obstacles, right? But I think there's an older Christian ideal of the hero, of a hopeful hero, someone who is totally investing themselves, their action, their ideals, is willing to sacrifice their life, but is ultimately resting that belief not on their own power, but on the power of their community, the power of their friends, and of course, ultimately the power of God. I think the hobbits in Lord of the Rings are such an example of like this hopeful, heroic figure. We could go on much longer than that. That's kind of initial response. So I think we can have both tragedy and comedy, and then the question simply becomes, how do we make the tragic anti-hero ridiculous and recover this sense of the hopeful, slightly comedic hero?
Do I have time to respond, or do we?
Yeah, John, thanks. That was really great. And Tara, I just invite you to respond. I think there's a lot there to think about.
Wonderful. Well, I suppose the thing we're sort of dancing around in this conversation, John, and that I think it is difficult because it does require certain like philosophical, or one might even say theological commitments, is like one account of the world is, if we are realists to a certain extent, and I think we both are, there is a true account of the world. If we are, which is to say, I think okay, let's say we can say life is absolutely worth living, and there are certain things about the nature of God and reality that make the world good. We can say it's not, and we are not, and we do in fact live among the bug bed and the hellscape. Or probably something like 3, which is reality is only about perception, and therefore it doesn't really matter. But if you pick 3, then in a sense, our creative responsibility, if the world is simply what we make it, I would posit that it is better to make it a good world than a bad world. So I think whether or not we're pure relativists, wherever we fall in the relativism spectrum, we might posit that a good world is preferable to a bad world, whether we are simply recognizing the truth of it or co-creating it in whatever regard. And I think these are not just like modes of existence that we can kind of try on as aesthetics, but these are also philosophical. I think we are as human beings like narrativizing creatures. It's one of the things we do. We tell stories, and one of the ways in which we make all of our decisions, political and otherwise, is through the stories and our own self-understanding, which comes to us received through this kind of soup of cultural stories that precede us, from myth to tweet and everything between. And so I think it's, to say how do we switch modes is also to say how do we encourage shared narratives that emphasize what I believe to be the truth of the world as a Christian, which is that all will be reconciled, A, and B, that there is something ontologically, there is something with like weight that is good about our life with one another, that is perhaps imperfect, that is perhaps broken, perhaps even difficult, or even within the paradigm of like the human condition and our propensity to sin, impossible to make perfect in this world. And yet still our relationships with one another have a certain kind of weight and seriousness. And this is why I think the recovering the comic and the tragic is perhaps more pressing for me than the sort of notion of recovering the heroic in the comic, is precisely because I think there is something so individualistic about, let's at least say, the contemporary, the anti-hero narrative. I'll put the hopeful hero aside for a moment, which is to say, so much of the tragic anti-hero narrative depends on the idea that he is, and it is usually he, sometimes she, alone in the world, that other people are among the obstacles he must overcome. And I think you talked about friendship earlier, and I think friendship is actually a really important piece of the puzzle, because I think that the ways in which our friends see us, our community see us, always, like, I think of Sancho Panza and Don Quixote. Like, it is very difficult to have one's self-serious mode of oneself in isolation when there is someone who cares about you, in relation to you, next to you, kind of looking at you sympathetically and saying like, sure, okay, those windmills can be giants today. And I do think that one of the sort of ways in which we go from a kind of like aesthetic conversation about modes to like a political conversation about how we live in society is through the ways in which we can bolster friendship as the sort of political mechanism that gets us out of certain kinds of self-narrativizing spirals and into thinking of ourselves as communities of people who both care about one another and pull one another out of solipsism. And of course, Lord of the Rings, the friendship of the hobbits, another great example there. And so I think that very much my concern, and I do grant, John, that this is not, the sort of tragic mode is not simply a reactionary or a right-wing phenomenon. I think you're completely right that there's the kind of more progressive version, or the like gestures broadly at all this meme version. But I think that it is precisely in seeing the worth of one another, like actual human beings, that we have to kind of live with and be in community with and build a polity with. I think it becomes much more difficult to theorize the world as simply belonging to all this when you're talking to your neighbors and kind of participating in the ordinary and, in my mind, sacred elements of daily life. Now, to your second question, I mean, I feel like, again, we're also sort of dancing around the Kierkegaard in the room without naming it, but I think that there is at its best, the hopeful hero does, I think, one might say, the knight of infinite faith. I think that there's a difference between asserting oneself against a kind of hopeless world, which I think is what the kind of tragic hero does, and asserting with the humility of not knowing what the reconciliation looks like, but a kind of faith in the good that is abstract precisely as an act of humility. That I think is what, and we're talking about now again, the sort of Kierkegaardian figure of the knight of infinite faith does. I think that faith, that there is something to all of this, that there is something worthwhile, that it may not result in a kind of happy ending for our tragic hero, but that there is a kind of worthwhileness to certain kinds of self-sacrifice, physical, emotional, or otherwise, where some reconciliation, be it in the afterlife, be it in the New Jerusalem, be it in the kind of way that the world looks on the other end, is worth it. And I think that there is a kind of wager, and here, that it is a wager on meaningfulness. And I do think this is kind of an existentialist choice that we do, I would say, like, pretty much all of us, maybe even I'll go so far as to say all of us do have to make as we construct creatively or simply receptively the narratives of what it is to live in the world. We do have to wager on the is it worth it? And I think that that is an act of hope. The wagering on meaningfulness is an act of hope. And I think that again, going back to the question of, like, is it true? Are we in relation to which is where I think hope and faith turn into one another. And again, this is coming from a Christian perspective, but is the world good? Is life worth living? Is there something there, or isn't it? And if there isn't, what do we do about it? And one can say, if there's no such thing as God, let's all just be like something between Nietzscheans and hedonists, and maybe that is also intellectually viable. So I certainly think it follows. Or there's a kind of stubborn refusal to accept this, and there's the kind of, well, maybe nothing means anything, but I'm gonna wager that even though nothing means anything, that actually it does, in the sort of comic reversal at the end. And so I think that kind of regardless of what we believe or have faith in, insofar as we do have the opportunity to make a choice, that the wager on meaning is always good, because either we're right, or, well, I think we ought to be right, and we might as well hold on to that and create, as to the best of our ability, a world in which this becomes true. So I'll stop there.
Wow, we've got some great questions, but can I briefly respond to Tara on two?
Absolutely. Yeah, go ahead.
So I really liked your point about the way in which friendship and community sort of inherently undermine the notion that, like, the tragic antihero, as part of performing this role, has to reject any of those, like, small comforts of being with other people, but also that's the thing that prevents him from realizing the ridiculousness of a situation. And I think I'm not someone who's a kind of doomer about social media or technology, but I do think one danger of our particular form of kind of internet mediated society is that it becomes much easier to engage in a kind of pseudo relationship with others, where we aren't actually confronted by, you can find all the other doomer atomists, people, you can congregate together on the internet, but also you can caricature or present other people to fit your own narratives in a way that's harder in person. But the second thing is, it's funny, you've spoken like a true fiction writer. In your three takes of the world, you presented the third as a matter of narrativization. We can decide how, if the world's sort of indeterminate or relative, then we can decide how to narrativize it. And it's certainly true, but as someone more political, someone who's thinking about the political dimension of this, I also think that it becomes a question of power, right? Mm-hmm. And this is the kind of right Foucauldian position as well. You've said that it's all knowledge power, so let's get some power to change knowledge power. And this is, to my mind, why I find the effective altruist crowd actually quite dangerous in ways that they don't appreciate yet, which is that it is ultimately Illichian expectation. The belief is not that the belief is that we have the power through our tools to create this sort of perfect future. And there's a kind of overcoming of all obstacles, of all natural obstacles, in the pursuit of creating. They don't believe that there will be this future. They believe that they could create it with science and technology. And that, to my mind, is potentially a recipe for disaster. And this also gives me a chance, and I'll wrap up with this, to say something point to something I wanted to say earlier, which is that in Brothers Karamazov, it is this valence of how do you see the world that's sort of fundamental. I don't owe this insight. This is my great Russian professor, Olga Mirsin, pointed this out to us, that, Dostoevsky uses this sort of polyphonic narrative style where he doesn't just come out and tell you what he thinks usually, but the structure of the book is itself the message. And it's interesting that in Later, after the Grand Inquisitor, there's this hagiography of Father Zosima, and there's an interesting figure in that hagiography of his brother Markle, who dies at age like 17 or 18. And there's this interesting, there's a sort of foreshadowing or not foreshadowing, connection between him and Ivan Karamazov. Markle is also scornful, an atheist, like very intelligent, interested in philosophy. But then he falls ill, and in his illness, he has this radical conversion, where not only is he taking a sober account of his life, but he actually becomes sort of saint-like, to the point where he has a kind word for everyone. He's saying sort of the most beatific things, including, he says at one point, this is the crux of the book, I think, actually. "Don't cry, mother," he would answer. "Life is paradise, and we are all in paradise, but we won't see it. If we would, we should have heaven on earth the next day." So the sense of the kingdom of heaven is within you. And then everyone else thinks he's nuts. Like the doctor hears him say this and says, okay, the disease has gone to his head, right? So I think he's this kind of interesting holy fool in miniature. I mean, that is the question, do we live in a tragic world? In which case, that kind of tragic hero response is a noble one. Or do we live in heaven? And in which case, it's a completely ridiculous response. So I'll leave it off there. I know we've got some great questions.
That was great. Thank you both for a rich conversation already. I think we'll transition to Q&A, but I'll take the prerogative of the moderator and ask the first question. So, but I'd also invite everyone to raise their Zoom hand if they want to get in a queue to ask a question. And I was struck, Tara, in your remarks about your description of the kind of black-pilled personality as being quite self-aggrandizing. But because they're so solipsistic, because they're so individualistic, they're actually end up paradoxically being more accepting and more resigned, actually sort of less of a threat to the system. Whereas those who hope, who love, who engage in a kind of comic world or live in that, the pessimists think that they're foolish, but they're actually capable of action in a way that a kind of resigned, hopeless person is not. And that led me to think about just people that I know in my life who I would characterize as having a very strong formation of a virtue of hope, of hopefulness, who engage in projects in society and have families and give themselves away to people around them and build toward the future. Sometimes those people are actually very pessimistic about politics, and are often because they're not online and reading news all the time, they don't care about it. And so my question, I guess, for you, Tara, for both of you, is just how do you think about the formation of a virtue of hope at different scales? I mean, there's a private scale, and then there's a public one, and there's a political one, and how do those two things link up? Tara, I'll just start with you.
I mean, I think that the cultivation of the first becomes a kind of cultivation of the second, which is to say, the more that people in your actual community, friends, but also neighbors, become real people, and the more kind of you're able to condition yourself to think of politics as something that happens among people working out how to live together, as the kind of, for better and for worse, as the kind of primary the model that both individuals' desire to do good and personal desires for power and self-aggrandizement kind of get in the way. I do think that, not to say the personal is political, but I think in this case it is. I think how we teach ourselves to be with the people in our lives, if that has no relation whatsoever to how politics is done out there, I think that something has gone sort of horrifically wrong. And I do think, therefore, that, I mean, I'm a big believer in kind of very hyper local politics and the kind of work that we do, on our block, in our street, being a kind of politics that kind of leads us in the direction towards the other bigger thing. So in that way, I think that the virtues that I would probably call them like the virtues of loving attention, to paying attention to one another, getting outside our own heads, and sort of encountering the other not as a character in our personal dramas, but as sort of someone else with interiority and wants and needs, and getting us to a kind of polyphonic political experience, to use your word, John, rather than a single narrative. And I grant that this is probably kind of sort of hippy dippy and idealistic. I mean, I don't know how we get from like, all my neighbors in my building and I co-adopted a stray cat, to give you an example. that did actually happen recently. But to like, I don't know how we get that from there to extremely well-run government that supports the vulnerable to the greatest extent possible. But I feel, my sense is that this is perhaps closer than that. Either, again, it is a kind of wager. Either the cultivation of virtue, including civic virtue, is meaningful in some way that maps onto the way that human beings interact, or, as John said, and I think you're completely right in your kind of expansion of that sort of relativist world, or it's just about power, and life is about power relations, and we should just like take over the establishment and make it do what we want and become a certain kind of top-down authoritarians. And again, then I think, and this is perhaps where my most sort of self-narrativizing is, that like it is an existential decision to be made, and I don't know whether I personally in good conscience could make that decision to kind of enter the power world of politics, even if I quote unquote knew that to be the quote unquote correct pragmatic decision. So in this, I think it is, and the act of faith and the act of hope do come together.
Well, and to add the act of love, I mean, I think a politics of hope is a politics of reconciliation, ultimately. And I think that's one of the reasons why it's much easier to have a politics of hope at a local level, where the problems in front of you are tangible, when it usually seems to admit some kind of compromise or positive sum solution. And I think that one of the potential sources of our politics of hopelessness has been the displacement of real power from local and smaller levels higher and higher. And you can actually see the kind of dialectic of hope versus expectation, right? Our desire to control and confront real challenges has caused us to displace power in order to create the possibility of that expectation of being able to control the future. But in doing so, it's made it harder for us to control our own destinies in a way that's contributed to this sort of crisis of hopelessness. I think there's a reason why, I'll make everybody mad with this comment, but this is a reason why, I think the three great American political figures of hope in the last, who really used hope politically in the last 70 years would be like Martin Luther King Jr., Ronald Reagan, and Barack Obama. And I think to the extent that there is disappointment, especially with Reagan and Obama, it was the extent to which they weren't able to kind of achieve that politics of reconciliation in office for a variety of reasons, not all having to do with them. So I think that's my response to that question.
That's great. Thank you both. We have a number of questions in the chat. I'd also remind people that they can ask by way of video and audio. We have a question here from Phil Gorski. Good to see you here, Phil. If you want to ask this yourself, you can, but I can just read what you wrote. Is contentment with the ordinary, is contentment with the ordinary possible without experience of tragedy? The example that he gives is of the cult of domesticity that followed the horrors of the mid-20th century. And then he also writes, relatedly, could the hobbits have been conceived as heroes except by someone like Tolkien living in the era he lived in? Since John brought up the hobbits, he could respond perhaps.
Sure, and a great, Phil. It's a great question, and I also think I wonder whether we need to distinguish between almost two inverse things: a kind of a domestic scene, which is actually in a way a kind of flight from evil and a flight from the problems, versus a hopeful heroism, which is an attempt to confront the reality of evil in a serious way. So on the first hand, I think a lot of the cult of domesticity, I mean, some of it is a good kind of hopeful, guys coming home from the war, having seen with their own eyes Buchenwald and Dachau, and just trying to come home and make a life. Some of it, though, was, I mean, if you know well, I know you know a lot, that for you the 1950s are not this iconic image. You actually know the sociology of that period, and it was in some ways a devastating period of alcoholism and domestic abuse and trauma and horror that was just being kind of constrained within the walls of the home. And this similar note, my family came to the U.S. from a Jewish family from Vienna in the 1939, and in the Jewish community in Vienna in the 30s, there had been this inward turningness, right, of keeping your head down. There's a period in which you saw much less public participation by Jews in Austria and Vienna, much more investment in luxury in private life, luxurious interiors and music and the private life of the home. And it was a kind of way of avoiding the rising threat of anti-Semitism. On the other side, you have people like Tolkien, you have people like Auden, who, somebody gave that beautiful Auden quote from a poem he wrote when he first heard the news of the outbreak of the Second World War. People who, because they have seen it for themselves, understand the reality of the tragedy of the world, the reality of evil, and are grasping for a way to confront that without losing their humanity. So I think so that's what I would say. There's actually kind of two modes of response to the confrontation with real horror.
Tara, do you have anything to add?
I mean, I think that I'm wary that sort of a narrative that says something like tragedy makes us appreciate the good more. I don't think that's quite right. But I think that there is something almost shockingly good about the things in our lives that do tend to be good, that don't have to really exist the way they do. That there is, I think when we become strangers to friendship, to romantic love, to sort of family, to suddenly these kind of phenomena seem just like the fact that they don't have to exist, but they do, that we can. And I think I certainly found that after the pandemic, like being able to sit with people I cared about inside a room indoors felt like such a miraculous thing. And so I think that it is true that we kind of, when these things are made strange to us, I think we are able to see them more fully. And sometimes tragedy can make the things we take for granted strange. That said, I think we haven't talked about this, but we don't kind of need, quote unquote, war or certain kinds of pandemic to be aware of the possibility of the tragic. I mean, we all die. Death is something that is just encoded in our, unless we're going kind of full like transhumanist, we can beat death for everyone. There is a kind of finality that we do have to reckon with, and we do have to kind of, our own mortality, the mortality of those we love. That is like, I don't think an account of the comic that leaves out or doesn't reckon with what death is or means, whether it's a Christian perspective that does affirm the resurrection, or whether it's another account. I think tragedy is always sufficiently with us without kind of needing it in a world historical sense.
Jay Tolson, editor of the Hedgehog Review, you have a question?
Yes, thank you, Tara and Jon. Those were great reflections. I want to focus a little on that word sexy, and in thinking about what makes a certain outlook appear sexy. And you talk a lot about the internet culture, particularly social media, Twitter. But I think obviously the ground was prepared well before those media became so prevalent or even entered the scene. And there are things about modern American culture, Western culture, maybe world culture, that I think have made us suspicious or even unaware of the virtue of hope, that it is a virtue, and that it's not just optimism. It's not a sentiment. It is a virtue that has to be cultivated. And is there, would you step beyond the internet culture, Tara and Jon, and say that the sources of a kind of hopelessness in our culture have pretty deep roots, struggling out of, as Phil says, coming out of World War II? I don't think a lot of people recovered from that. Our issue, our current issue, does feature a long essay on the eternal hope of the wandering Jew. I think it's very hard to come out of the experience of the mid 20th century, earlier 20th century, with a sort of secure sense of hopefulness. I know we have another contributor to that issue here too, who has some thoughts about that. But I would just like to ask you whether, do you see, and you're writing your own fiction too and contributing to this, do you see among any of your contemporaries or those slightly before you, artists who were writers, novelists, filmmakers, who were trying to assert, I can think of a few, I think, who were trying to struggle against the dominant tenor of the modern age, which unfortunately I think is the dominant tenor, and I think it does fuel the despairing ones of the right and the left. But I'll let you both answer.
Jon, you first.
Oh, putting me on the spot. I mean, I think it's such an important question, Jay, and I'll leave the aesthetic considerations to Tara. I do think that this question of when did we become so hopeless is a really important one. One person who's thought about it, you might not expect, in 0 to 1, Peter Thiel distinguishes between different kinds of optimism, and he sees a kind of inflection point sometime in the 70s or 80s, which, by the way, incidentally, is when we, for good reason, began to put up a lot more regulatory barriers to doing anything, and it's possible that there's this kind of, his thesis anyways, is this kind of material dialectic between the exhaustion of the Western world and its sense of hopelessness. Although he also, I think, thinks he sees a spiritual dimension too, just based on other things he's said and written. So I'd say two things. There's a philosophical answer to this and a theological answer to this. The philosophical answer, which I haven't thought enough about, is something around the displacement of hope in favor of expectation, especially as we see sort of the rising, which I think maps onto both the kind of rising practical power of science in the Enlightenment and afterwards, and then on a more theoretical note, the displacement of the kind of reification of the subject-object distinction before Descartes, but really especially after Descartes, right? There's a world out there, there's a world in here, and as in, that distinction then creates a space of conquest, right? It transforms reality from the dimensions of creation, where both it and I are all part under this aegis of created beings, to one in which it's a field for conquest. The theological answer is that, and I think Benedict XVI's encyclical Spe Salvi is maybe the best place to go look at this. But if you believe in the eschatological narrative presented by the Bible, or the view of history that Christian theology has, then it stands to reason that undermining Christian hope, especially if it can be done in such a way that the church didn't even realize what was going on, would be a very powerful tool to undermining a whole lot of other Christian goods. Let's just put it that way.
Tara?
All right. I think I will take over the optimism. So artists more broadly that I think of as kind of beacons of optimism. Of hope more than optimism, let's say. So one sort of relatively recent, though no longer living, writer that I think of as often is Iris Murdoch. And what I love about Iris Murdoch, I think she's very clear-eyed about people's foibles, which I think as a novelist, you might have to be. But there is a kind of loving dimension with which even her like messiest characters are treated. And there is a sense that all of these people, selfish though they may be, self-deluded though they may be, are looking for something. And there's a seriousness to which even their kind of most unhelpful, worst desires, you kind of see the good they're tending toward. And then two cinematic examples, actually, that I think are more recent. I always think when I say the best Christmas movie that everyone should watch, that is also one of my like theologically best movies, it's Whit Stillman's Metropolitan, which is about privileged Upper East Side debutantes in 1990 and could have been something very different. And it is in fact about a group of people living together in friendship and what that means. And I always think of that like this weird joy in that movie about the possibility of friendship to transform us, and the possibility of goodness as coming from a community that's trying to figure out how on earth to sustain itself. And sure, the community is Upper East Side debutantes, and yet they're taken so seriously as people despite being ridiculous, overly intellectualizing teenagers. That narrative move, that like vision of what it means for people to love each other. I always think like if you want a Christmas movie about hope and love, and it's set during Christmas, so everyone should watch it as Advent comes nearer.
We had a question here from Joshua Thorough, who wanted to ask Jon to clarify. He says, I didn't quite see who you think occupies the hopeful right quadrant of your Punnett square. Can you say more?
It's only fair to be asked this question. I'll just give 5 examples. I'm not going to explain them in the time we have. And I actually think, to make it more controversial, I actually think they agree more than they disagree, or a lot more than people think. So the 5 examples I'll give would be C.S. Lewis, Ivan Illich, Wendell Berry, Stuart Brand, and Peter Thiel.
You're not going to explain?
I mean, I think they all have remarkably similar visions for what a hopeful future rooted in Christian theology would look like.
Interesting. Someone in the chat commented, Peter Thiel, he's what makes me feel hopeless, but to each his own. Phil had a, go ahead.
Reconciliation is an important question.
Again, I just remind people they can ask a question by raising their hand. Phil Gorski writes, just a quick reflection on Tara and Jon's responses to my questions. As a professional sociologist and amateur historian, I'm inclined to emphasize the temporal and cultural context as opposed to the existential and aesthetic. So while I think that Jon and Tara both make a good case for the possibility of contentment with the ordinarily human and hopefulness about common life, I wonder whether the probability that many will experience this as a reality is substantially lower, and that social media is just one more reason, and possibly not the most important reason for this.
I mean, I think Phil's undoubtedly correct. We've had this. I think someone might have been Jay pointed this out earlier, that or pointed towards this. If you look at a lot of the stuff around self-creation, a lot of this are thinking about declining trust in institutions, the declining sense of hope. These trends all substantially predate social media by at least 10, probably 20 years, right? Many of the movies movies or cultural artworks that feel most sort of emblematic of how we feel today were produced before the internet. I mean, I think, for depending on the crowd, for the different reasons, like Fight Club and The Matrix are both movies that are about mass media before the internet. So I think it's absolutely true. And I think there is a kind of this is what I said earlier about the kind of politics of hope. I think that the extent that we are displacing the possibility of real meaningful action, to the extent that we are continuing to adopt social, economic, and technological forms that atomize, that alienate, that make it more difficult to have friends and make it more difficult to have a family, that there's a kind of vicious cycle of politics of hopefulness. I mean, I think a serious conservatism would take increasing the number of people who have close friends or have a family, that want to have a family, as like a top level political goal. And the fact that nobody has said that means we don't have a serious conservative movement in this country. So I guess that's a bit of a black pill, but I think I agree with that.
Bill, did you want to follow up on that?
Yeah, so I'll ask a real question instead of just making a comment here. I mean, I guess another thing that I wonder is to what degree this sense of tragedy and hopelessness is also a result of the kind of confluence of two larger cultural narratives. On the one hand, a meritocratic narrative, a kind of meritocracy that many people feel excluded from and scorned by. And then on the other hand, what I guess I've called elsewhere a disenchantment with disenchantment. And this I think you actually do see in an aesthetic register with the yearning for heroism and extraordinariness and superpowers, right? There's a phrase that's sort of become part of our common parlance in recent years, and that this you really do see also very much in the cultural realm, but also, and importantly, in the political realm as well, with a longing for kind of heroic leaders, messianic leaders with various kinds of superpowers. I mean, and this is really sort of this is another question, whether that is inevitable without a strong sense of transcendent that's not just aesthetic.
I think it is, but I even wonder if it's even inevitable with a strong sense of the transcendent, which is to say, I do think that our kind of collective hunger for transcendence in its kind of absence in the day-to-day does mean we look to be part of meaningful narratives, and the political sphere is one where we can kind of transpose our own private narratives onto the sort of something between entertainment and politics that is happening around us. That said, I don't want to posit whether a loyalty to a king we might have thought but ruling by divine right. I don't know how the medieval peasant felt about that, whether there was a kind of similar faith in a different kind of political transcendence, even with even with a kind of existing transcendent realm. I don't want to speculate, but my instinct is that I think that we are, I'd say, perhaps no hungrier or less hungry than we once were, but more willing to kind of cobble to get together narratives from kind of multiple disparate sources rather than from a single unifying source. And then I think the question kind of remains, are any of these stories right? And are any of these stories true? Because I think in the absence of thinking one or the other is right or true, we come back to where you were, Jon, which is that, is this all just a relativistic world of power relations where we are always in thrall to stories of power and those who can exert it and those who can best control both narrative and those who can control narrative have power. I don't think that is true, but I think it is a plausible worldview that to be taken seriously and remain in dialogue with as long as we have these kinds of conversations.
I'm just quickly to follow up on that. I mean, I do wonder to what degree the real criterion that many people effectively apply in the narratives that they adopt is whether they're true or not anymore, or whether it's really whether they feel empowering.
Well, I mean, one of the things that I think a major change we have seen is the degree to which our aesthetic and feelings and our feelings more broadly are understood as authoritative in a certain way, which is to say, I think, and this is now the subject of my next book, which is coming out next year, but the degree to which what we want in particular and what we feel to a secondary degree, but really what we want is seen as kind of an authentic manifestation of some kind of truth about the world. I think that has really come to the forefront of the way that we culturally talk about self-knowledge and ourself and our relationships with the world. So suddenly our own narratives are given, perhaps it's not that we have developed these kind of heroic narratives, but that we are in a culture that encourages us to self-narrativize and to think of our self-narration as authoritative, so that our inner self is kind of our authentic self, rather, is what is more authentic, the story in Don Quixote's head or his relationship with Sancho Panza. I know where I come down on that, but I do think that the more our own feelings and desires are understood as authoritative, the more power our own individualistic self-narratives have, rather than being one among many narratives we have access to in a kind of Dostoevskian polyphonic world of narratives, if that makes sense.
If I could add to that really briefly, I would just say that this is one of the great challenges that we are facing now, and will only get worse over the next 50 years, which is a media political economy that generates its power and its wealth from entangling the self and these broader narratives, whether they be true or not, in a much more foundational way. And that's the subject of, I'm writing the 8-part series on this for the New Atlantis, which I just linked. It's only going to get worse. Yeah.
James Madden, you had a question.
Yes, thank you so much for being on. Tara, I loved your article. Just a brief background on me. I'm an Anglican church planter in Dallas, Texas. And one of the things that you said from your article that really got me was that love wins by changing the story altogether. And from your article, I've noticed that we have a lot of young adults in our church, and pretty much none of them would frame their lives within the narrative that you describe, though almost implicitly or in the background, these dynamics are going on because half of their lives, if not more, are experienced online. And there is this underlying sense of hopelessness. And there's this kind of re-narrativizing that either occurs through being mindless observers on social media or like re-curating through social media. And so my question then, in light of that kind of observation background, is I'm trying to wonder how, through, I guess, maybe embodied liturgical practice of the church, what can I distinctly as a pastor introduce people to that might have this sort of changing the story through love type thing? Like, I think the church has something unique in the local context, and I'm trying to figure out what a first step of that is. So thanks.
Well, for me, I'll speak only as I was sort of an adult convert, raised kind of Christmas and Easter Episcopalian, came back to practice as an adult, studied theology in the meanwhile, so sort of was primed for it. But honestly, it was the fact that this stuff was true, or that this stuff was presented to me as true. And like, if this was true, if God didn't indeed become man and die and rise again and all of that, that in and of itself was such a kind of world-shatteringly big deal that it was what brought me on, so to speak, on board. And I think too, I mean, I am someone who responds strongly aesthetically to certain kinds of aesthetic liturgy. I'm a sucker for beauty, and did that help? Yes. I hope that I did not become a Christian for the smell of incense alone, and I don't think that I did. But I think that the combination of appealing to this aesthetic that I did have, along with this kind of joyful sense of hope and community that all came from the sense that this thing was true. I think obviously what was something to be avoided is people who are uncertain or questioning or can't understand how the resurrection could possibly be real, feeling like they're not welcome in a church. I think that's bad. But I do think that the kind of the truth claims were the thing that got me. And I'm always a little bit reticent when sort of conversations are had about, how important is like certain forms of doctrine anyway. I mean, I think there are other areas where there is sort of openness to debate, but I think at the end, the kind of the truth claims being made are transgressive and transcendent enough on their own.
So I actually gave a paper on what Anglicanism has to say about technology at a conference this past weekend. If your question is how do you think about practices of formation and counterformation to this kind of narrativizing, I think you have the most powerful technology ever created for this question, which is right here, the Book of Common Prayer. Literally get as many people as you can in your church doing morning and evening prayer together. Especially maybe one or the other, morning or evening prayer, maybe over Zoom at first, and I know Dallas is hard, but if you can do it in person, you can do it in person in a church with the whole shebang, even better. It's such a powerful counter liturgy to the way we get in our own heads and narrativize ourselves. I mean, I think especially the Book of Common Prayer, it's basically like a neurolinguistic hack for English speakers. The language is so deeply embedded in what we think of as that which creates a sense of the sacred, of the meaningful, that it's almost kind of liturgy on easy mode. Start with there. I mean, we have this, there's a reason why so many of the Christian thinkers, including Lewis and Illich and George Grant and Marshall McLuhan, who were serious about the problem of technology, they all saw education as a solution, by which they didn't mean K-12 education. What they're really talking about was Christian formation. So I think the whole kind of recovering the tradition of formation and formative practice in Christianity is Christianity's answer to these questions.
Thank you.
That's great. That question of formation reminds me of something that Tara wrote in her piece. It's you write, perhaps it is obvious, but it must nevertheless be stated that such pessimism is fundamentally aesthetic. By this, I do not necessarily mean that it is a posture or even a vibe, but rather I mean that the appeal of this pessimism is less about logic or metaphysics than the alluring narrative it presents. And I was wondering if Tara, you could say something about the role that narrative plays in that kind of formation. I mean, it strikes me, Jay and I were talking about this, I think yesterday, about how a lot of the cultural energy over the last 20 years has been channeled into prestige television shows like The Sopranos or Breaking Bad, which I love both of those shows. But there's a variety of them like that are extremely popular, and they're very, very dark. I mean, you watch one of these episodes and you go to bed depressed and you say, oh, wasn't that great? What role do those kind of stories play in the kind of formation that you're talking about?
I think that this goes back to the question of the sexiness of pessimism. I think that we are primed to think of as serious, worthy of respect, and exciting, the sort of stories of certain kinds of evil. And I think that they're attractive because what they offer us is a sense of superiority to a certain kind of world. They make us feel like we are initiates in a very closely guarded secret that, and then this is sort of me going on my own little sort of aesthetic rabbit hole here. I recognize this is not self-evident, but I do think that like what we get from watching the same way what we get from watching like horrible torture porny movies like Saw, it's a similar kind of feeling that like I'm seeing this horrible thing, I'm apart from it, but I'm able to withstand it. And the reason I'm able to withstand it is because I see the world in this sort of initiated way. And what like I find very strange is like, actually, there's nothing particularly transgressive in being pessimistic anymore. If anything, like that is the kind of cultural default, which makes it to me even more uncanny that we're participating in a kind of simulacrum of transgression by playing around with this idea that we alone, except for everyone else on, watching HBO's Game of Thrones or what have you, can see this fact about the world, because we are not like, and I think that there is that move that we are not like the bourgeois naive fools who get easily scandalized, or who want to the parents that want to ban the show. And so I think that there is a kind of the seduction of a lot of, and I don't think this is true of like all tragedy. Like I very much love a good Greek tragedy, but I think at its best, certain kinds of tragedy can be forms of catharsis, forms of experience. But I think that the kind of cultural pessimism that is often proffered to us is this kind of, I don't want to say not true tragedy, but is more about inviting us into a very private mood of feeling good about ourselves, rather than a kind of communal experience of I think there's a sense of the brokenness of the world. And I'm gonna I recently saw a production of actually Oedipus Rex in Sicily last summer that I thought was incredible, and I'm working out as I talk what made that in my mind good. And I think that there's something about the kind of impossibility of situations where people are trying to work out the good, and it's really, really hard to figure out what the good is, and sometimes seemingly impossible, and people fail. And that seems to me to be something that is very moving. But I think that often versions of the stories, and I'm gonna use Game of Thrones as my example because I'm more familiar with it than I am with the other shows you mentioned. But I do think that once that sense of the good even being a goal is lost, there does become this kind of smirking sense of transgression of like, oh yeah, people are awful. People just want power. Isn't it terrible? Ooh, good thing we know that. And perhaps that's unkind or overly critical, but that's my perspective on the matter.
Paul Franz says it's good to remember too that Greek tragic trilogies conclude with satyr plays. And also your comments make me wonder or think that is there something going on here in the medium, television?
Yeah, absolutely.
Versus the stage.
So well, not the medium. The medium isn't television. The medium is streaming, which actually is completely different.
Yeah.
So I read. I mean, the great one of the great theorists of post-journalism, Andre Mir, has written about this. I borrow from him in a piece I put in the chat for the New Atlantis, how Stewart made Tucker. This is all downstream from the shift from mass media based on advertising to subscription media based on selling subscriptions of various kinds. I mean, that feeling Tara mentioned of you're not like other people, you're special, you're in the club. That is the feeling that subscription products need to generate to sustain themselves. In addition, they have incentives to create for anxiety. If you want to come back and see what's going on, whenever you feel anxious or threatened, the sense is I need more information, right? And that's true whether that's about the news, which is why subscription-based news heads in this direction, and of tragedy, right? The golden era of comedy is the golden era of mass advertising. Why? Because you have that kind of vague feel-good feeling that makes you want to buy the products at the various commercial breaks. You can run that because everything ends well in the end. You can run that over and over and over again for years. So some of these comedies go on for like a decade plus. So I do think some of these effects are simply downstream of these foundational media ecosystem changes.
We have just a couple of minutes left. I'll throw it over to Jay for a last question.
I hope it's not the last question. I was just thinking, I was looking for monuments of hopefulness in recent cultural production. And I was thinking immediately of Terrence Malick's Hidden Life, based on the prison diaries of Franz Jägerstätter, which I think is one of the most powerful, real depictions of what hope is about, even though this is, in as darkly apocalyptic time as possible. And I think Malick's treatment of it is one of the more interesting aesthetic treatments, because in his typical style, it's very slow. It's very sort of, Paul, you can talk about this. It's very attuned to the natural world itself. I mean, it really is a source of the kind of profound hopefulness, and also his faith, his Christian faith, that allows Jägerstätter to simply refuse to be drafted into the Wehrmacht and die for it, and yet remain completely hopeful to the end about his decisions. So I think it's there, but I think, Jon, in your acute media analysis, has recognized that we have fewer and fewer of these collective cultural experiences that we share. Appointment viewing being one, and streaming allows us to individualize even further our cultural choices and picks. And they do tend, I think Tara is absolutely right, toward a kind of appealing darkness and nihilism. And it's a very compelling force. And it comes out of, I think, authentic sources, which we've talked about already. But I hope I hope that this issue raises the issue of hope in a way that moves it beyond being a sentimental question, but to being a profoundly political and cultural one. I share with Jon a kind of despair at the absence of concern with authentic hope in our political leaders. It's something that I hope can be recuperated on both partisan extremes. I would like to hear why he thinks Thiel is one of the hopeful figures, but that's subject for another discussion. But Kyle, I'll let you have the last question, Kyle. This is your show.
Well, I think we're at time, so we should conclude. I just want to express my deep appreciation to you both, Tara and Jon, for doing this with us and having such a rich discussion. I think we all agree that it was that it exceeded our expectations and our hopes. And I want to thank all of you for being here for this Hedgehog Noontime discussion. And please head over to hedgehogreview.com to subscribe and read more and to read Tara's essay. And we'll see you all soon. Thank you very much.